quiz, and I realize for those in the back, this might not be super duper clear as well for our friends over here on my right. Does anyone recognize where this is? Would it help if I threw this statue up? And no, that's not the Rhinebeck Village Municipal Parking Lot. That statue is a doughboy. I hear Lexington. Yes, this is Lexington Green, also known as Battle Green. And 3 weeks from tomorrow, I, your county historian, will probably be imagining that I'm going to be freezing my bottom off there at 3 a.m., assisting the town of Lexington with rope line interpretation, because that will be the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which kicked the whole thing off everywhere except for New York. Yeah, I know, right? Well, we always like to be fashionably late to the party. The 1770s was no exception. And of course, that would be Concord Bridge, where the day more or less concluded unless you were British regular and had to run all the way back to Boston. So what are we going to be talking about tonight? It's more or less what is happening here in Dutchess County and in New York more broadly that gets us up to 1775. Because I'm going to guess that many of you have heard about things like the Boston Tea Party, maybe the Boston Massacre, Sam Adams, who has enjoyed real renaissance as a zombie brewer, you know, come back from the dead 200 years later, and no one remembers your beer recipes. You might have heard some stuff about Virginia, especially the other end of the war, Cornwallis, 1781, surrender. A lot of stuff happens in New York, both before the war kicks off, during the war, and afterwards, like the Bill of Rights, you know, that starts here in New York. But we just haven't done the same level of excellence at the promo game that Massachusetts and Virginia have. So we're going to start to try to turn that back tonight. So when we think about Dutchess on the Brink and New York on the Brink, that is a lead-in into what scholars call the British imperial crisis. That imperial crisis runs from 1763-ish right up till 250 years ago from 3 weeks from now, which sounds like a word problem, and yeah, math, not my strong suit. But anyway, right up till April 19th, 1775. And how do we get there? Well, again, 300 years of American history for you here tonight in 30 minutes. First, we're going to be talking about, super briefly, the period of benign neglect, which begins with the first English colonies in 1585, goes right up until 1763. Then we will be looking at what are the highlights of that imperial crisis here in New York, because it hits differently here than it does in Boston, which tends to soak up most of the attention from the Stamp Act on through to April 19th. And finally, we're going to bring us right up to the edge of that breaking point, which we will return to in our May program. So we're going to keep you on the edge of your seats for like a month and a half, which is right where I want you. So, without further ado, our salutary neglect, benign neglect as some other historians call it, from 1585 to 1755. That's like 4,692 years. You can see why I'm a historian and not a mathematician. But it is a really long time. It starts with our very earliest English colonies here on North America. And yes, the Spanish started earlier, the French started earlier, the Portuguese, big players early on. But with us, it's Roanoke Colony in North Carolina. They actually make 3 attempts, but the first one is 1585. Does not go so well. We still don't know where they ended up. Secondly, we have Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. That stuck around, foundation of modern Virginia in the South. And then finally, the colony of Plymouth, which they insist that I spell with an I. It was the 17th century. Anything went as far as spelling goes. That's 1621. From there, we spread out across the eastern seaboard and move west. Now, during this period, basically constantly, from the 1580s and well past the end of the American Revolution, we have constant warfare going on. Some of these are the wars of colonization, pitting settlers against indigenous people. A lot of them are extensions of European wars. So you have King William's War, 1689 to 1694, which just happens to line up when William of Orange, also William and Mary, if you know that band, is fighting the French in Europe. So every time there's a war in Europe, there's an accompanying side hustle here in North America. You have Queen Anne, also known as the War of the Spanish Succession. That happens here. Dutchess people are actually involved in that. Most famously, locally of all, is King George's War. All sorts of Dutchess County guys go off to fight in that. It's generally the French versus the British, or the English, depending on whether you're before or after the unification. But that brings us, so that entire period, 1585 right up to 1755, the English are kind of like, all right, at least the English government. We've got people, it's basically like us having colonies on Mars. You know, we've got people way, way far away, can't really talk to them effectively, never see them, but the stream of raw materials keeps coming to us. We get our iron, we get our tobacco, we get our rice, huge thing, even in the 17th and 18th centuries, we get our indigo. The supplies are flowing well. We don't really need to worry about it. We send a royal governor over every now and again to remind them that there is a king 3,000 miles away or a queen that they need to pay attention to. Everything changes in 1755 due to this gentleman here. Can anyone make an ID on that guy? Yes, Skip. I feel like that was cheating to let you answer. Yes. That is young George Washington, the first of two Georges that we'll be meeting tonight. So, the French and Indian War is pretty much the first colonial war to actually spark an accompanying conflict in Europe. And George Washington kicks it off single-handedly at Fort Necessity in, 1754, when he signs a document. He doesn't read French. His interpreter, it turns out, doesn't really read French either. He signs a surrender capitulation after going too far into French territory and being surrounded. They're like, all right, you sign this piece of paper, go back to Virginia, everything's over. Because they didn't read the 24 different articles in the capitulation, they missed the one where George Washington admitted to assassinating a French officer, which then becomes the cause of war back in Europe. So if there's one person who can be credited with American independence, it's George, because he's like 20 years before everyone else is thinking about this. He's on the game. So he kicks this off. It spreads worldwide in 1755 because all of these major European kingdoms at this point, not necessarily countries per se, Great Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, to a certain degree even the Portuguese, when they start fighting, all of their colonies start fighting too. So this conflagration spreads throughout the planet. They're fighting this in India. They're fighting this in the Pacific Ocean. You know, they can't talk to each other. It takes like 3 months for a letter to go from London to India. They're gonna fight all the same. So this is a mighty, mighty endeavor that ends with British supremacy certainly in North America and the Caribbean, and arguably everywhere else. This is really the start of the sun never sets on the British Empire, because the British managed to kick the French out of Canada, because the French would rather hang on to their greater revenue-generating properties in the Caribbean, those sugar islands. They kicked the French out of India. They kicked the French out of large portions of Africa. And they end up with a pretty amazing level of really monopoly win here, like all of the properties. And everyone who has to pass through those has to pay them money. But they quickly become a victim of their own, success. That's what the imperial crisis is all about, because before 1755, and really even through 1763, the colonies are quite happy, especially the 13 of the 26 North American colonies are quite happy with just being sort of loosely part of the British Empire. You have access to 18th century Amazon because British shipping carries everything you could ever want from any part of the globe. And as we see with store ledgers that are preserved here in Dutchess County, folks living in what is today Millbrook, which would have been one of the most difficult places to reach in Dutchess County in 1774, have access to everything that the folks down in New York City do. So that's a pretty powerful motivating force to, like, you know, you're signing up for your streaming TV. That's the one that gives you all the options. But things start to fall apart in 1763. And this is normally where, if we were not talking about New York, we would start talking about people in Boston with last names like Adams and Hancock. But we are here in New York, so we're going to look at some government stuff. This is a quick, for those of you up front, I know it's not that visible back there, this is an image of the battles of the French and Indian War, and you can see that they largely happen here in New York. Yes, there's some stuff down in Pennsylvania, there's stuff in the South, but there's a whole lot of fighting in New York, which means there's a whole lot of British Army officers and British government officials, not the people you want to know what's going on in the colonies, passing through our colony. Now, of course, our state. So what happens? 1760, but really it hits in 1763, we have a change in management in the British Empire. This is not good for the British Empire. Just want to point this out, especially not for retaining provinces that have more or less been accustomed to ruling themselves, like New York. New York's basically had royal governors show up every 10 or 20 years, hanging out down in New York City, and the homegrown elites, like our friends the Livingstons, because we are kind of technically on Livingston Manor here, they run the show, so everyone's happy. That's about to change because of this guy. So this is not George II, but George II, this guy's grandfather, dies in 1760, as a result of which his grandson, George III, who had both daddy and granddaddy issues with authority, comes to the throne. And this is our second George. So he automatically becomes king in the fall of 1760. They take a year to organize the party. He's coronated in 1761. Most eligible bachelor in the British Empire at this point in time, and then marries Charlotte. So, what is the problem with George III? He is a young king. He has not left Great Britain. He has what some would describe in the period as an unhealthy interest in farming. This is not a guy whose punch list includes conquer the globe, make the French people cry, steal all the Spanish wine. That's his grandfather, George II, at the time of George II's death. And if you're wondering about that death, it's very similar to Elvis's death. Just going to leave that there for you to think about. At the time of his death, everyone in charge of the British Empire is thinking, all right, George II, last British king to command troops on a battlefield, like not 5 miles behind the line, but on the front line. He's going to tell us to keep going until all of the world is Britain. We're just going to throw everyone out of every country. If it takes another decade, who cares? Because we're making a lot of money from this war. His grandson, George III, comes in and says, you know, I don't like wars because they kill my subjects. I prefer that we focus on commerce, we focus on farming, we think about philosophy. He was a very gentle and genteel soul compared to his grandfather, his father, Frederick, who died about 20 years before this time. George is just not a guy who's going to be out there trying to conquer everything. Now, the result of this is he tries to be, in his own words, the patriot king. So he's trying to chart a political path that serves his subjects. Unfortunately, when you try to do that in 1763, what you introduce into the equation politically is for the period profound instability, which turns out to be very bad for America. So we're going to do my favorite game, Prime Ministers by George, because from 1714 until 1820, the crown of Great Britain was worn by 3 guys all named George. Yeah, this is why I became an English historian first. So George I reigns from 1714 to 1727. He has, count it, one prime minister. Robert Walpole considered to be the first prime minister, and that's a whole nother story behind the prime ministers. Walpole is in office from 1721 until 1742, 21 years as head of basically the functional part of the state. That's like having one guy in the White House for 21 years. Except Walpole is a professional bureaucrat as well as politician, so he's mostly interested in keeping the wheels moving forward. He's there so long that he overlaps with the reign of George II, who is helpfully George I's son. And if you're confused, don't worry, we can talk about it afterwards. George II, he's on the throne from 1727 until 1760. He has 6 prime ministers. So one prime minister for 21 years, maybe that's a little bit of a symptom of stagnation. Maybe we want a little bit more variety. 6 seems like more of a rounder number for, almost 40 years worth of reign. That's great. So what's George III going to do? Hold your breath. He has 11 different prime ministers just through the end of 1783. That's 23 years, 11 prime ministers. He doesn't quite replace them every 2 years. Some of them, like Lord North, serve more than 2 years. Some of them serve a matter of months. But that means you have a tremendous amount of turnover at the top. And if you want a visual representation of it, those are all of the prime ministers of George III. He has more than 11. He's got like 20. Now, of course, we don't need to worry about that because we're pre-1783, so I helpfully crossed out all of the ones that are post-1783. But the issue is, when you don't have some form of stability, it's like there's a reason why terms of elected office in America are either 2 to 4 years, because you can kind of count on having the same person around. When you don't have that kind of timing, it means that things are up one day, they're down the other, they're twirling the other, memos going all over the place, everyone's confused, no one knows what's happening, and this creates a very dangerous opportunity for imperial bureaucrats who are not elected, and this is, perhaps some people are now thinking, this sounds familiar. Imperial bureaucrats to say, well, the boss is not paying attention. And I like things in nice, orderly rows. I like government efficiency. And we've just discovered that we have possessions across most of North America. In fact, we've got an image of it there. So basically, every place you see that's a dark color on this, and my apologies again to my friends over here, that belongs to the British Empire. After 1763. That's 26 colonies. We tend to forget about the other 13. So the normal discussion in this is that, Britain's massively in debt and they have to tax the colonies to pay for the war. It's like, guess what? Empires live in debt. Like, no one has a balanced budget in an 18th century empire. Do you think the Spanish and the French are worrying about that? No. It's something far, far worse. It is bureaucrats based in the Greater London area looking at this map and saying, wow, that's a lot of territory. And we've heard all of these stories from officers and other fellow bureaucrats returning from their service in the French and Indian War. And we just have this feeling, we know it's not actually going to be written down until the 19th century, but we have this feeling that we need to make the world of England. This seems like a pretty good place to start. So yes, the tagline is taxation, but the reality of the situation from 1763 right up to April 19th, 1775 is assimilation. Before 1763, the colonies are generally spoken of as like, well, they're kind of like an English shire, a county, but they're super far west of Cornwall, and we hear from them like once a quarter. To now, it's 1763, all the bosses are busy trying to figure out who's going to be fired tomorrow, who's not going to be fired tomorrow, where are we going to go for drinks if they're not fired, where are we going to go if they are fired. And the more middle and lower people are being like, you know what would look great on North America right now is English tax code, English governance, maybe we can take vacations over there, and we want to make sure that what we see when we land in places like Philadelphia, Manhattan Island, Boston, pretty much looks like the same sort of things that we see when we take a ride down to Kent, or maybe visit our estranged uncle out in Devon or Cornwall. We want to make the world England, which doesn't really fit when a lot of the world isn't compatible with England. And that is what brings us to the imperial crisis writ large. This is going to be governmental stuff. You're going to see some things in here that sound familiar, I hope. Some of the names of these acts. Begins in 1763. They're delayed slightly because there is a major indigenous war called Pontiac's Rebellion. You know, clearly that naming implies a certain perspective on the issue that might not represent everyone involved. But Parliament, because they have staffs who inform them about these things, are like, yes, we like the idea of making the world England. Let's legislate, because they could. You have a one-party dominance in Parliament at this time, the Whigs. And if the Whigs want to pass something, it gets passed. So they're not going to hold back. First, we have the Sugar Act of 1764. What's that all about? Well, one of the big wins in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War to us, it lasted 9 years here, it lasted 7 everywhere else. You have all of these sugar islands because, you know, sugar is processed mostly in one place in the 1760s and 70s. All of that trade is going up to the American colonies, so why don't we just put a tax on sugar? Because we know everyone's going to buy it, because who wants to have their tea without sugar? Or better yet, who wants to live a sugar-free life? I'm sure at least some people in this room have endured that horror. I'm not there yet. I'm on the way. So 1764, they passed the Sugar Act. It is not met with a whole lot of enthusiasm because people in North America aren't accustomed to paying tax on anything, and it's not exactly a lucrative life for them. They're the ones growing and harvesting the tobacco. They're the ones who are out in eastern Dutchess chopping iron out of the ground. This is not easy living. It's not profitable living. That's the whole point of a colony. It's not profitable for the people who live in the colony, unless your name is Livingston, of course, or Van Ness if you go slightly south of here. But everyone else, it's pretty, to use a Red Hook term, hard scrabble life. So when prices go up just a little bit, I'm feeling a parallel coming out here. Everyone feels the pinch. So there are protests against the Sugar Act. It is repealed. However, no one in Parliament has learned their lesson. 1765, they're like, all right, we can't tax sugar. That upsets everyone. All right. What's something that we can tax that's super sneaky that only a handful of people will notice? We're going to tax stamps? No. We are going to require that tax stamps, as in, you know, not to mail a letter, but proof of tax being paid, are basically put on all paper goods. Everything from just plain pieces of paper to plain cards. And, you know, the iron miners might not be upset by this, but no one else will notice. Those people in Boston have plenty of money. They can give us a little bit of it. And by the way, everyone in England has been paying Stamp Act duties for decades at this point. None of this is new over in England. Their sugar's taxed too. Stamp Act crisis is when you first hear about Boston. It's when you hear about people being tarred and feathered. We don't quite go that far here in New York because, you know, we're classy people. Tarring and feathering folks, that doesn't seem very friendly, but still large protests and boycotts of goods. So Parliament takes that back, fine. But in 1765, they also passed something that is huge in New York, which is why it's not really talked about anywhere else. It's the Quartering Act. We will get to that in a moment, but just keep that behind your ear. So 1765, they've taken the Stamp Act away. No one really noticed the Quartering Act, and that's going to have unfortunate consequences. But as they take the Stamp Act back, they pass the Declaratory Act the next year, which says, well, you know, we took our Stamp Act back. We passed another law to repeal it, but we still can pass laws for America. Don't be thinking that this is some kind of admission that you guys are special and might deserve your own seats in Parliament. That's not what we're doing. 1767, so they tried sugar. That didn't really work out for them. They tried stamping goods, paper goods. Didn't work out for them. Quartering Act actually worked out magnificently for them. So we're going to package a bunch of bills together named after the prime minister at the moment, and we're going to pass that and hope no one notices. And unlike, say, the Sugar Act, which is on one specific commodity, the Townsend duties are on a broad variety of commodities. And they're thinking, oh, you know, it's just code, tax code, super detailed, fine print, no one's going to notice. Wrong people noticed. And shortly after the Townsend Acts are passed, things get so bad in Boston that British regiments are actually sent to garrison the town, because there is technically no police force in the 18th century British Empire. If you need police, you call the army. Not really the best way to do things. But, you know, they don't find that out until a couple of years later. In New York, there are protests against this, but it's not quite time to get rowdy yet. That will be coming shortly. There's the Tea Act of 1773. So this is where your Boston Tea Party comes in. And there's not quite a tea party in Manhattan, but we'll get to that. It's kind of close to that. This is what really ignites everyone, because they were upset about the Townsend Acts, though a little confused, as were the people who were supposed to enforce them. But tea? How can you be English and not drink tea? And the response from London, of course, is how can you be English and not pay tax on the tea that you're drinking? Because we all do over here, and we just want you to join us in our awesome tax-laden existence. Because taxes are civilized due to leading to more paperwork. And if there's one thing that makes the English English, it is their love of paperwork. And friends, I feel that deeply. I too love paperwork. So the Tea Act gets a bunch of stuff dumped in Boston Harbor, leads to protests up and down the eastern coast. So you have tea parties basically everywhere, from what is today Maine all the way down to Florida, to protest this. None quite as violent as Boston's. At this point, Parliament decides that it's time to send a strong, direct message to America. Something that everyone will get. But not something that will impact everyone, because, you know, the folks in New York, they weren't really happy about the Tea Act, but neither did they hijack 3 East India merchantmen and dump all of the tea into New York Harbor. So there's one standout outlier here that I think that we can focus on. We call them the Intolerable Acts. The English passed them under the title of the Coercive Acts. It's a bad sign when an elected assembly names their own package of bills coercive. They are sending a very direct message. So that bill package includes such lovely things as the Boston Port Closure Act. That means that nothing's coming into Boston Harbor and nothing's going out until it has been inspected by the British Navy to ensure that all duties have been properly paid. The second act, which is huge for, are there any folks from Massachusetts here tonight? Well, that's one person. So you know about Charter Day in Massachusetts, the Charter Oak, all of the charter stuff. Yeah, the charter is huge in Massachusetts. It was granted to them before the English Civil War. So we're talking pre-1640s here. It is the first real, well, it's the first documented evidence in the British Empire of a king saying, well, you know, I guess you can govern yourselves, whatever. Just keep like all of the important stuff that comes out of Massachusetts flowing to England. So the second part of the package of the Coercive Acts invalidates the charter, revokes it. and puts a guy that we're going to meet shortly, General Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America, and is the governor of the Massachusetts Bay. So now you have out-and-out direct military government, and one of the first things he does is to tell the elected assembly, you don't need to worry about gathering anytime soon. Go on home, enjoy your farms. And that is what leads our friends across the border to get super duper upset in the spring of 1775. Now, what does this all mean for New York? Well, they didn't like the Sugar Act. They didn't like the Stamp Act. They didn't like anything else that came after that. They weren't impressed by the Coercive Act. 0 out of 5 stars, do not recommend. But the Quartering Act hit here hard. Massive protests, unlike anything that is seen in the rest of the what would soon become rebellious 13 colonies. So the promo for the Quartering Act is, oh, well, you know, we're just kind of extending some policies and procedures manuals from England to North America that say how you're supposed to quarter troops if you don't have a barracks nearby, because English law since the early 18th century has said, well, we have a standing army, it is there for your own protection. If you don't build barracks to house our troops, we're going to need to house them, but because we're English people, we like to have paperwork. Pardon me for just a moment. I'm hearing the slightest amount of feedback, and that, like, one of the few things I can hear anymore. So anyway, if you don't build barracks, we're going to have to house our troops with you. You're going to get some roommates, but because we're English, we need to have regulations, we need to have paperwork, we need to have policies and procedures. So on the surface, what that Quartering Act says is, these are the sorts of homes where you can quarter troops. You know, preferentially, you're going to put them in barns and stables and public houses. If you can't do that, then, you know, basically not quite by square footage, but close enough. This is how many soldiers can go in this size home. This is what the family has to provide, where they have to live, and lots of minutia. However, the sort of fine print that the New Yorkers figure out that no one else does, because we do, as a people, read our fine print, we're very contractual like that, is that the Quartering Act actually extends the entire British military system across North America. So beforehand, there'd kind of been a code for how the British Army operated at home, in the British Isles, in Ireland, and anything that happened out in the Empire and the boonies, you know, whatever, do what you need to do, we don't really care that much. With the Quartering Act, all of those laws that govern how the British Army functions as a vital part of British civil society, because remember, no police. So if you are the government and you need some folks to help you maintain quote-unquote law and order, your only backup is the army. So Gage, who writes this, don't worry, we'll see him in just a moment, he's extending that entire system of how the British Army works in England onto America, which not only means, first of all, the British Army is going to be a permanent part of the new landscape here in America as the English make the world England. It also means that, in contrast to previous decades, where the military presence was going to be stationed out on the frontier, mostly to deter the French from attacking, now, from 1765 onwards, every major city is going to have troops, so that if the royal governor feels threatened or dyspeptic or is having a bad day, he can call in fully armed redcoats to back him up. So this is considered to be a measure to remind the elected assemblies that, well, you know, it's great that the people living in New York have elected you to represent them, like all 4 people in Dutchess County who can vote in 1774, but when push comes to shove, you're part of the British Empire. And the directives that come out of London, out of Westminster, you have to follow those. And we have redcoats to remind you of our love if you don't want to. Massive protests up and down the Hudson Valley, Even here in Dutchess County, there is a military occupation in southeast Dutchess County by the 28th Regiment of Foot from 1766 to 1767. They set up in what is now eastern Putnam County. But it's like, yeah, there was a redcoat occupation here in sleepy Dutchess. And if you want to hear more about that, come out to eastern Dutchess in June, where we will be sharing the details. None of this really changes anything to do with the Quartering Act or the extension of the military system, including the military justice system, to North America. All because of this guy here. This is General Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage is not really a fighting general, though he has done a lot of fighting in the French and Indian War. He was actually with Washington at the Battle of the Monongahela, also known as Braddock's Defeat. Managed to escape without being killed, which is a real achievement that day. He serves the rest of the war, but his real powers are in administration. So after each of these battles, he's thinking, I think our casualty report forms could be more effective if we added another column to it. That's the kind of mind we're talking about here. So, at the end of the 7 Years' War, 1763, basically it's a race to see how many and which British officers can get home. Whoever draws the short straw has to stay in America. Everyone else gets to go live the Bridgerton lifestyle in London. Guess which is more appealing? So Thomas is a little late to the game. He's stuck in his books. He's thinking about forms. And lo and behold, in 1764, when all of the faster, one could potentially argue smarter officers had left, he finds himself as commander-in-chief in North America, a post that he occupies right up through the fall of 1775. So once everything falls apart, a guy named William Howe turns up and relieves him. So Thomas Gage gets to sit out the entire war in the comfort of his London home. But meanwhile, while he's here from 1764 to 1775, he is the one who is charged with implementing a lot of these measures that come through. He is the one who ends up being the governor of Massachusetts when Parliament finally loses all of its patience with the Bay Colony. His papers survive. They are at the William Clements Library over at the University of Michigan. I've seen them as part of my own doctoral work. And starting in about 1770, we'll see why in just a moment, you see all of these letters coming into Gage, and he's based out of New York City. He does not leave New York, where he has between 1 and 3 regiments of troops at hand at all times. He doesn't leave New York until 1774, when the message arrives from London saying, hey, guess what? You've been promoted. Here's a new hat, governor of Massachusetts. You need to go to Boston. Is he going to go to Boston alone? No, he's going to bring those regiments with him. But at the same time, he is receiving an increasing number of requests from royal governors. Please send me a company of soldiers. Please send me 3 company of soldiers. Please send me a full regiment. Please send me every single soldier that is available over and over again, because these governors and the rest of the royal bureaucracy are feeling this pinch that is coming down on them. He, of course, it's just paperwork, not that big a deal, but things are starting to unravel even right in front of his face. So who here has heard of the Boston Massacre? Just show of hands. All right, that's pretty good. So the Boston Massacre happens in March of 1770, because this is like the one time where the Massachusetts guys are slow. We kick this stuff off in January of 1770 with the most remarkable battle that you've probably never heard of, which is the Battle of Golden Hill, down in New York City. So what happens? The Sons of Liberty are active down there, just like they are up in Boston. They've been raising liberty poles. They've been having a great old time since the Stamp Act. But it turns out that the British Army, the common soldiers, are actually more literate than anyone thinks they are. So soldiers and Sons of Liberty get into a pamphlet war. They're actually writing their, and this is a big thing in English culture throughout the 18th century. If you really don't like someone, You write pamphlets about how stupid and mean they are, and then they write pamphlets back, and this is how we solve our things before social media, but sounds a lot like it, right? So the Sons of Liberty are like, oh, Liberty Poles are the best, and the soldiers of the 16th Regiment of Foot are like, they are the worst, let's chop them down, it's super cold, we need stuff to burn to keep us warm. This all comes to a head in January of 1770, when the British soldiers are like, this could only happen in the British Empire, trying to nail up their latest broadside for the rest of the people of Manhattan to read, and some Sons of Liberty roll up and say, no, you can't do that. And this leads to a riot where there are no fatalities, there are some injuries. But the British troops actually win this one because their friends show up faster than the other Sons of Liberty do. But this is, we're reaching a boiling point here. It's not 1775 yet, but the violence is in New York City before it's in Boston. It's a super bad sign. So this is January of 1770. In the summer of 1771, someone new arrives on the scene. This guy here is William Tryon. And basically everything you might have heard about in New York that is named Tryon, including Tryon County, which no longer exists, is named after this guy. He starts off his career as the Royal Governor of New York, where he makes a big name for himself in 1770 by crushing an uprising making a name for himself in North Carolina by crushing an uprising called the Regulator Rebellion. If you've ever been to the coast of North Carolina, you might have heard about a historic site called Tryon's Palace, because when Tryon arrived, they're like, here are 3 different, not super comfortable wood frame buildings that you can live in as the royal governor. Which one would you like? He said, I really prefer brick. So the people of North Carolina are taxed relentlessly to build Tryon a brick palace, which still exists today. You can go see it down in New Bern. So out in the boonies of western North Carolina, all of these people rise up and say, we're not going to pay taxes so that the royal governor has brick instead of wood. Wood's fine for everyone else. Tryon pulls the eastern county militias together, goes out, crushes the western regulators at the Battle of Alamance in the spring of 1771. If there are any Outlander fans out there, this is covered in there, though not accurately. So the British Empire's like, oh, we've got trouble in New York, we've got trouble in Boston. We can only have trouble in really one place, and we like New York. It has the finest natural harbor north of the Caribbean. We need to hold on to that. I think it's time to replace the governor. Do we have anyone on our rolls who's recently distinguished themselves by crushing rebellions? William Tryon, would you like to relocate from North Carolina, even though your palace has just been completed? You moved in a couple of months ago, but wouldn't you prefer Manhattan? And Tryon's like, you know what? I think I would. So in July of 1771, he comes up. And his whole thing is, your orders are to restore order to New York's governing political elite, because they're beginning to fracture between the folks who earn a lot of money through imperial customs, through being part of the British Empire, and basically everyone else, an issue which touches here in Dutchess because it splits a lot of families. The De Peysters, the Van Nesses, the Livingstons, they will end up with having members of their family on both sides during the American Revolution, because when you're a super elite family and there's a civil war, you hedge your bets. One side of the family is going to win, they'll be able to preserve everything, it'll be great. So Tryon gets up here in 1771, and he immediately begins trying to do what he did in North Carolina. So he's like, all right, Manhattan's looking pretty shabby. Fort George especially, what is now Wall Street. That was one of the walls of Fort George, the British fortification guarding lower Manhattan. We're going to need to pass some taxes to rebuild that. We also need to overhaul our militia laws, because, the militia was really helpful for me down in North Carolina, and I think it could be helpful here too, but you haven't had a new militia law since the end of the French and Indian War. So we need to update those regulations and sort of things like that, which managed to alienate a whole bunch of people. And then we get to the Tea Act crisis. So we know that up in Boston, there's a huge tea party, things get thrown into the harbor. Things are more civilized in Manhattan because the Sons of Liberty, A, give warning that any attempt to meet or to land the tea will be met with extreme violence, and B, Governor Tryon keeps the tea ships away from the docks. His whole thing is, we're going to find some place on the coastline of Manhattan to land this tea in secret, in the dead of night. They'll never know about it. It'll show how much better we are than Boston at evading rebels. Well, after threats are made on his life by the Sons of Liberty, this does not end up happening. So he backs off, but the damage has been done because in August of 1774, people are preparing for the First Continental Congress. And in a place we know today as Stanford, a group of individuals meets on behalf of the people of the county of Dutchess to elect representatives to go down to Philadelphia in a few weeks to directly represent Dutchess County at the First Continental Congress. And to hear the rest of the story, you'll have to join us back here in May. Yeah. So that is 300 years of American colonial history in sort of 30-ish minutes. Thank you all very much. I'm hoping that was enough for everyone, but if there are a few questions, I can try to field them. If you'd rather eat and drink, I'm right there with you. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Enjoy your evening. And remember, April 9th, down at Foster's.